I appreciate having me here. And yeah, I'm excited to talk with all of you today about how the field of responsible AI has a learning and design problem. So as maybe no surprise to many of you, this is sort of the obligatory first slide in a talk like this. Generative AI can lead to a variety of harms. And these are just newspaper headlines I grabbed in the couple of weeks before this of New York City chatbot telling businesses to break the law, and a chatbot encouraging someone to kill the queen, and other incidents. But this isn't new for generative AI. As folks like Sophia Noble, Ziad Obermeyer, Joy Buolamwini, Timnit Gebru, and others have argued for years, algorithms might amplify or introduce biases in society. And this isn't new even for this current sort of generation of machine learning. You can go back to the 90s with Batya Friedman and Helen Nissenbaum's work on bias in computing systems. So to address these issues of biases, folks have developed responsible AI resources of various kinds. Some you can see here are sort of software toolkits for fairness analyses or transparency resources like model cards and data sheets. As well as some organizations like Microsoft, you can see here, that have developed processes for responsible AI. So this is a screenshot of Microsoft's responsible AI standard and their different goals for fairness and other principles in responsible AI. But it's not just technology companies. Public sector organizations have also developed responsible AI processes. So this is an example from the US NIST, or National Institute for Standards and Technology. And they've developed a AI risk management framework to govern, map, measure, and manage various risks in AI development. So in some of my prior work, I've developed some of these responsible AI tools and processes and studied how AI practitioners, including developers and others involved in AI development, use these tools as part of their development practices, including some of the organizational tensions that impact how they address fairness in their processes. However, in some of our prior work, and this is just an excerpt from one paper from 2022, we found gaps in AI developers' knowledge and skills when working on fairness in AI. So in this paper, we had 10 different AI product teams go through what we thought was a fairly straightforward process for fairness evaluations, using a sort of process and tool that our team was developing. And we observed them go through this sort of fairness evaluation process. But nearly every single team that participated in that study ran aground on one of the very first steps in that process. And we include a quote here from one participant where first the teams were identifying who should they evaluate fairness for, as in which groups of potential users might a model perform worse for. And we heard over and over from participants in that study that they didn't feel equipped to answer that question. And as this participant in that study said, well, we just want to be told who we should think about fairness and bias for. But as you can imagine, at a large technology company, at the time I was at Microsoft Research, at a company the size of Microsoft, working and deploying systems across dozens or hundreds of different countries, even, and cultural contexts. This is a really difficult question to answer centrally, and yet the developers felt unequipped to answer or sometimes even ask that question themselves. So this leads me to the first study that I'll talk about today. So given these kinds of gaps in AI developers' knowledge about responsible AI or fairness and bias, in this study that we published at the FACT conference this year, we were exploring how AI practitioners were learning about responsible AI on the job. And this is with a great team of collaborators, including folks at Google Research, and Shivani Kapania is now a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon. So some context here. Responsible AI involves new forms of work that AI developers may not be trained for. And there's been some evidence for this from a number of different studies, including the one that I just mentioned that we published in 2022. And in parallel, many universities are developing tech ethics courses. Many of you may be familiar with the embedded ethics program here. Shout out Benji and others. There's been some great work from Casey Fiesler at Colorado University Boulder surveying some of these tech ethics courses, right? Trying to understand who is teaching ethics in the undergraduate and graduate computer science curriculum? How are they teaching it? How is it integrated with sort of more with other computer science concepts? And this work is incredibly important. It's really exciting. But if you're a working AI developer, you may not have taken that course in your training, and you may not be may not have the time or inclination to take courses for fun after work. And some more recent work from my collaborators and I found that AI practitioners are taking on extra work to educate their team members about responsible AI. So former intern Chelsea Wang, now postdoc at CMU, she found that UX practitioners, UX researchers, were teaching some of their teammates, data scientists, software engineers, about harms that they saw in user studies. But this was not part of their job description. This had to come out of time that they could devote to other things. And in another paper led by a PhD student, Wesley Deng, we were looking at this kind of cross-functional collaboration. So how do teams from different roles, product managers, software engineers, data scientists, UX researchers, social scientists, how do they come together to collaborate on fairness? And one of the challenges in that paper we found was an issue of a shared language of people from different disciplinary boundaries kind of talking past each other. So, and needing to educate, like, well, what does fairness mean in my field or in your area, and that sort of thing. So we were getting some of this evidence that people were taking on additional work. So that's motivated two main research questions for this study. First, what and how are AI practitioners, and I'll describe who I mean by this, what are they currently learning about responsible AI? And second, what are AI practitioners and a second group of what we in this paper called responsible AI educators, what are their goals and aspirations for teaching and learning about responsible AI, and what sort of challenges get in the way of those goals? So to do this, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 40 participants from 16 companies, including AI practitioners in roles like software engineer, program manager, UX researcher, and others, as well as this group of what we were calling responsible AI or RAI educators, not working specifically in industry context, so not necessarily university faculty. Some of these folks, as you can see in the roles here, had explicit job titles like curriculum lead or technical writer, but others were taking this kind of work on informally in addition to their roles as software engineers or program managers. And let me just say here too, when we think about sort of the audiences for these learning resources or trainings, in this paper we focused on AI practitioners, including both developers of machine learning or AI models, as well as developers of applications that those models are embedded into. But there's a much larger set of potential audiences for on-the-job learning about RAI, including third-party AI applications, marketing, PR, how do they communicate what AI can and can't do to the public, corporate leadership, and then broader audiences, many of which are in, for instance, like the tech ethics courses in universities, but community organizations, civil society, public sector, policymakers. I think there's a large landscape of potential audiences for learning about responsible AI that we did not include in this study. So we asked them a couple of things, focusing broadly on how they learned and taught others about RAI, in what settings, for what reasons, what was more or less effective. what types of topics and skills did they teach or learn, which were harder and easier? How did they develop, for the educators at least, how do they develop those trainings or resources? How do they decide on the learning objectives or assessment? And then what did they want? What were these sort of aspirations for learning and teaching about RAI? Okay, so what did we find? First, what are practitioners learning about responsible AI? We did some analysis of some of these sort of learning objectives and sort of concepts. Some are fairly high-level concepts like recalling the company's principles for responsible AI, defining different dimensions like fairness. But others were more sort of what we might call procedural knowledge, like can you compute a fairness metric for a particular use case like text classification? Or can you create a data card or model card? Those of you in the audience who might have some education or learning science background might notice a couple of things here. First, we found that broadly, the resources helped people learn these well-defined RAI processes like calculating metrics for fairness, but far fewer were designed to help develop skills to identify new potential harms, or ideally proactively design generative AI to avoid those harms for new use cases. And in the second half of the talk, I'll talk a little bit more about that proactive design portion. But the other thing you may notice is that many of the learning objectives that I mentioned focus on understanding and recall. Which those of you, again, with an education background may be familiar with this Bloom's taxonomy of cognition. And, there's critiques of this, and there's other taxonomies you might use, but most were focused on these sort of base levels of, recall this definition or this fact, rather than applying that to new skills or use cases. So how are developers learning about responsible AI? There's a few different modalities, some text like documentation, notebooks like Colab notebooks, toolkits, training videos, YouTube, and some, although this is rarer, some collaborative learning settings like discussion groups. But we've identified a few different pathways. So first was people adapting knowledge from other domains. So participants shared how they learned about ethics in their courses largely outside of computer science. One participant said, well, I was a health and social psychologist, so I learned about ethics there, and that got me thinking about responsible AI, and now in my current role, I kind of brought that with me. And we heard this from others in city government and ethics in education. But this relies on learners being able to translate and apply what they learned in education or healthcare or city government to their work building AI. And that application is a skill that many developers may not have or might need to foster and cultivate. So the other key pathway that we found was that practitioners are foraging for RAI resources, including searching internally in their own companies like repositories, externally on social media, and cobbling these resources together, kind of stitching together a curriculum for themselves. As numerous participants shared, well, it's more of a self-study of online resources. There was no internal course. It's grassroots. You have to go out and find it. It's self-learning, no formal course. And we heard this over and over, even from people whose companies we later found out did actually have trainings in responsible AI, but maybe they couldn't discover them. Maybe they were searching the wrong keywords in their repositories, or it wasn't required or anything like that. And the other challenge here to this kind of like information foraging is learners were finding resources, learning about ethics and responsible AI via social media, but were often unclear, and many participants were concerned about the legitimacy of those resources or the creators, seeing many AI influencers on social media and not really being sure if actually that what they're saying is grounded in research or facts. And the sort of last learning pathway, we had some evidence from prior literature that learners are learning from their coworkers in structured settings, unstructured conversations. And we had a follow-up study led by Jay Marie Solis. She led a little bit of a deep dive into how these kind of like informal sites for learning happen, maybe in a code review setting, and software engineers sort of raising questions, teaching each other, or learning collaboratively together in these code reviews or reading groups. Or as one participant said, well, this AI image generation model called Lensa launched on, and there was this strike on Instagram and social media, and they heard from their family protesting it, and that was sort of what really raised their awareness about the risks of AI. Okay, so as the second part, we wanted to understand what were the orientations towards responsible AI in these various learning resources. And in the paper, we get more into the details. I encourage you to read it for more, but we talk about two main framings for responsible AI. One is a computational framing, this very technical approach, and some of you might be familiar with some of the work on fairness metrics, and I mentioned at the beginning of the talk some software toolkits and libraries, some of which I've contributed to. I'm a maintainer for one open source toolkit myself, so some of this critique I take on as well, but this pure technical approach to responsible AI or ethics, despite knowing that they'll have to go back and actually see how were people affected by this system or model failure. And this computational orientation affected every part of the educator's choices for what were the learning objectives, the goals, how did they encourage learners to demonstrate mastery over concepts. Assessment is one version of this, but otherwise demonstrating mastery. And then how do they teach it, right? So this kind of computational orientation. As one participant said, for more technical things, we can just borrow from how other technical projects are assessed, calculate this group conditional true positive rate or what have you. But for this participant, they said, well, if we have more qualitative things, like how does this system impact this community different from another, or it's not a math test, as this participant said. However, there are methods from the humanities and the social sciences for assessing less quantified concepts. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
In their view, was it, I've got the measures and the packages and the methods and that's it? Or were they aware that there were things beyond that?
It's a great question. I'll touch on it a little bit later, but I would say it's a mix. I would say for the most part, a large number of participants were aware, yes, we would love to do that, but they themselves did not feel like they had the training to develop assessments around sort of qualitative concepts, or even going back to that sort of issue I mentioned at the beginning of the talk of teams not knowing which communities or demographic groups might experience fairness harms for a particular system. There's maybe methods from sociology or various other sort of social sciences, but the educators themselves, by and large, had computer science training, and so they were. This PA team is alluding to this themselves. They're I know how to assess somebody on calculating these various confusion matrices or what have you, but they didn't feel like they themselves. So there might need to be a sort of train the trainers kind of situation.
How bad did they feel about it? Did they view it as a problem? Initially, I think it would have just been I'm an engineer, I have to solve this problem, that's someone else's issue, or they're I feel stuck.
Yeah, it ranged. I think, and I'll touch on this in a little bit, but there was a lot of recognition that there was a scope issue here, right? That they knew they were teaching these easy to teach concepts. I keep going back to the fairness metrics. I think that's the most indicative. But things like creating model cards or data sheets, right? It's okay, we know how to create a data sheet, and we can teach people how to create a data sheet or a model card. But is that the same as really understanding why or what we're communicating, or for instance, training data and whether that should go in? So some of these broader questions they knew were important, but maybe didn't know how to make the time, even for the educators, make the time to teach, or for them to upskill on how they might convey that. Then the other orientation, and I think actually the aspirations I'll talk about in a second, does touch on both of these things. The other orientation we saw was what we call a procedural orientation, where in a lot of these trainings and learning resources, participants felt like they were teaching their companies responsible AI principles or policies or toolkits. And this participant describes it as a process objective, right? Like, are you doing the process correctly rather than this outcome objective? And there was some ambivalence in the paper. We do get more into this in detail of participants sharing how, well, you might need to do this to create culture change. And in fact, in some of my prior work too, like we've tried to embed these like proactive playbooks for fairness evaluation of like, at this stage in problem formulation, ask these questions, do these kinds of things. At this stage in model training, ask these questions, etc. But there is a very like, participants were ambivalent, right? On the one hand, if you want to change the culture of development, you might need to require those processes and thus teach those processes to get people to do them. But participants raised concerns this might lead to this very sanitized version of ethics, where normative questions of what should or should not be designed are avoided in the first place, right? For instance, things like military applications or like policing technologies, perhaps a fairness evaluation may not address the underlying root issues at heart. And so for some participants, it's like, well, okay, we can follow our company's policy or process, but that might not actually help us raise these larger questions. So given that this is sort of how these trainings and resources are framed, what do people want out of this? First, touching on question, there's a lot of desire to move beyond just the sort of technical approaches to focus more on sort of social and cultural elements of RAI. Some participants describe this as like sociological, anthropological angles. But this is beyond what many AI developers were trained to do or typically do. And I just want to shout out here two recent reports, one from the Data and Society Institute and the other for the Center for Democracy and Technology on why AI governance needs socio-technical expertise. So I encourage you to read these for a little bit more on suggestions on how to bring in some of these more sociological approaches into AI governance. The other piece of this kind of understanding harms was people wanted to know, how do we engage with communities to allow them to identify potential harms, understand what harms mean for them, ideally proactively co-design AI systems with them. And this is something that like a lot of participants, a lot of AI developers, they knew that they might want to do this. They knew this was a good thing to do, but they didn't feel like they had the skills for how to do this. And I have a recent paper with some collaborators from Microsoft understanding a little bit more beyond just performance disparities of language technologies, what those impacts might mean for speakers of different language varieties. So as one participant said, like, well, we have this risk assessment, like, we say these are these possible harms for these groups, but like, we should bring people from those different groups in and co-design with them, run evaluations with them, diary studies, etc. And then the second big aspiration here was building capacity for responsible AI. So what do I mean by this? Broadly, this means like wanting to apply what they learned for their AI applications. So you can think of this like tech companies have these sort of AI principles, right, about fairness or bias or transparency, but these are really high level. And what that looks like in, for instance, education might look very different than what that looks like in healthcare or financial applications. And that's just sort of the use case that also looks a lot different from one cultural context to another. And practitioners didn't feel like they had the skills to apply what they learned at this kind of like high level, this 10,000 foot level, for their specific products that were being used in all of these different sort of cultural contexts and use cases, et cetera. We explored a little bit of this kind of translation work in a follow-up paper that presented actually just a couple weeks ago at the CSCW conference. But I think there's a lot bigger questions here on like, how do we build this capacity for application, for translation? As part of this, participants wanted like customized trainings, like, okay, well, I'm working in the sort of South Asian context or Latin American context. What does responsible AI, what does fairness mean in this context? Can we get a customized training for this? The educators, at least as technology companies, didn't feel like they either had the time or resources or capacity or knowledge themselves to develop those customized trainings, but this is something that was desired. And then people wanted more case studies, more scenarios, more examples. And we found there's a lot of like toy examples and a lot of these like the same examples, same case studies that get reused over and over and over that might not actually be relevant for their use case or application. And I will say in the paper we talk more about it. This issue of application of learning about RAI at a high level is even more exacerbated for generative AI models where, ostensibly a single pre-trained model can be used for a number of different applications and contexts. And so putting more of the onus on the product team who's using that pre-trained model to do that ideation work of what do harms look like in their use case. So if this is what folks wanted, we found organizational pressures and tensions that impacted these aspirations. Some that resonate with some things that have been seen in prior work around RAI practices as well. So despite educators on one hand valuing collaborative learning, interpersonal learning, for instance, as one educator said, well, these socio-technical concepts, like gender discrimination, is easier to learn in person through Socratic conversation, Socratic dialogue, than reading a documentation in a software library. But these educators felt pressure to scale their learning resources and trainings, particularly at large technology companies. Scale is sort of an implicit value, for better or worse, of many technology companies. And this value was being replicated even within the educators, feeling like, well, these like self-study courses, they scale, even if they're not as effective. Similarly, educators wanted to develop this more like longitudinal like curriculum of increasing depth, but the learners felt they had pressure to ship products quickly. So they wanted something, a 5-minute tech talk or something. They could absorb it and then move on. And maybe that could lead to a more engaged, deeper sort of learning experience. You might think of the term like a low floor but a high ceiling, right? Something that could bring learners in, engage them with like a little teaser that starts them on this pathway. But as I mentioned from that sort of information foraging, there really aren't many well-structured pathways for people to continue this learning in more depth. And then finally, educators wanted to foster mindsets rather than prescriptive guidance. But these kind of organizational pressures to like ship products quickly, scale up quickly, incentivized, even from the learners, this kind of prescriptive guidance. So as one educator said, like, yeah, their learners are saying like, look, I have to get through our AI review process. Just tell me what that thing is that I need to do so I can do it, right? This very like compliance-oriented approach. But there's no one answer to RAI. As another person had said, like, there's no way to say, just do these 6 things on a checklist and then your model's going to be fair and then you're all set. So there was this kind of competing demand of like wanting to be told, how do I get through our launch process? What is the most prescriptive guidance, you can give me versus educators saying, well, we really want to foster these mindsets to allow people to reflect more on their own. Okay, so I'm going to move a little bit more quickly through the discussion here, but I encourage you to read the paper. This work has some implications for the learning environments for RAI, including how the sites for learning impact what is learned and how. If this is, happening within large tech companies versus perhaps open source platforms might have some of this kind of learning embedded within them, informal sites for learning, community-based learning that might avoid this kind of like procedural approach, right? Like you can kind of squint and see if you're a large technology company, why you might want this procedural orientation. Like everybody has to go through this review process. Let's teach them how to go through it. But other sites for learning might avoid that constraint. How do we design more socio-technical learning opportunities? So integrating these social and technical skills and concepts, both in the learning objectives, the ways of demonstrating mastery, and the pedagogical approaches. And then sort of building off of that, how do we resist what Timnit Gebru and others have called the hierarchy of knowledge in learning about RAI? So in the paper, we get more into it, but how might we shift the professional norms, the identity of what it means to be an AI developer, or what some sociologists have called the epistemic culture for AI development, towards responsible AI, rather than decomposing responsible AI into a separate thing for other people to do. How do we sort of shift the culture of AI development? And in the paper, we raise some questions, since, again, if and when this takes place within corporate contexts, this might be hard, but for the field as a whole, how do we develop these pedagogical provocations to kind of destabilize some of these more hegemonic values? But I know that's a meaty question, so happy to talk more with folks later. I encourage you to read the paper for more discussion. So I want to move to a second study that kind of pulled out some questions from this work, including how we support this learning in situ or in context, and kind of picked up that question of fostering mindsets, applying these concepts in development to meet learners where they are. And this takes me to the next study I'll talk about today, around supporting responsible AI during prototyping processes. And this is work led by a former intern, Jay Wang, that we published at the CHI conference this past year. So had an amazing project team led by Jay, along with some other folks. So, as is perhaps not surprising, now developing AI applications using LLMs is now easy, right? So thinking about what I was talking before about like, oh, AI practitioners, and that category may not actually be stable, right? Like, who is an AI practitioner? Is it anybody who uses a AI Studio or GPT Playground or what have you to embed some LLM into their tool or application with an API? Maybe. If that's the case, then developing these responsibly is increasingly hard. So this is a quote from a paper 5 years ago now, led by Ken Holstein, where they surveyed machine learning practitioners. This quote, you just have to put your model out there, and then you know if there's fairness issues if someone raises hell. And in that survey, they did interviews as well. In that survey, they found that nearly half of the 300 ML practitioners found fairness issues in their products. 99% of those who found issues found them after deploying the models. And I would wonder, how different is that today? If we were to run the same survey 5 years later, how different? How far have we come since then? So I mentioned at the beginning of the talk these responsible AI resources. In some prior work with collaborators, we analyzed 30 of these responsible AI or AI ethics toolkits, for looking at different kinds of things about them. But one of the things we saw was that most were focused in downstream development phases like model training, testing, deployment, and monitoring, and far fewer on the design phases that might be able to intervene before deployment. And there are some resources around design ethics, but not specifically for AI. So their goal for this study was, how do we support responsible AI, including this kind of like learning learning through development? Maybe it's not a formal course or something, but how do we foster this mindset during the design phase? So moving away from this kind of development deployment towards ideation, prototyping phases. And these were bullets from the first half, but as I mentioned, like most of those learning resources focus on, or few of those learning resources rather focus on design phases or design skills. So that was kind of motivating some of the focus here. And in particular on proactively designing generative AI to avoid harms for new use cases and new contexts. So to do this, we started with a formative study, a co-design study with AI prototypers. And this is, again, may not be like a stable category of people, but these are people who were using Google's AI Studio, one of these sort of like LLM prototyping interfaces. And we worked with them to generate and critique different sort of design ideas to foster this kind of proactive ideation about potential harms. We then took, you used the API for the AI incident database, which is a repository of, it was at the time 3,000 news articles about AI incidents, and extracted the embeddings from those, and computed the cosine similarity. This is, you can read the paper for more of the details, but to look essentially at the similarity between the prompt and some of these headlines, some of these news articles of AI incidents. As in, and I'll give you an example of what this might look like here. okay, let's say you're using one of these prototyping tools and you're trying out, maybe you have an idea for like a translation app. And you type in the sort of system prompt here of you're a good translator. There's with caveats around how much detail you might provide, how you would frame this, et cetera. And you give some examples of this. The model, or the tool, which we call Farsight, and you can read, or you can find more details there, along with a demo and the API for it at the link, then computes that cosine similarity between the prompt translation app and these AI incidents from the AI incident database to pull in related news articles about, in this example, translation failures, and suggests some potential use cases generated, again, based off of those embeddings, for potential misuses of this tool. Again, all with the kind of a goal to foster this mindset, foster this ideation about what could go wrong early in this prototyping phase before any product has been built or launched or deployed. And then there's an interactive sort of tree visualization here that's the model, the tool Farsight suggests use cases, suggests different stakeholder groups or different groups who might be impacted by this model, and suggests potential harms based off of a harms taxonomy from Renee Shelby et al., a systematic review of socio-technical algorithmic harms. Now, so this is the sort of tool here, and again, I encourage you to check out the demo and read the paper for more details. But we wanted to understand how this was changing the AI prototypers' ability and approach to identifying these harms. So we did not want this tool to replace that harm ideation. We wanted it to augment people developing these tools. Again, thinking about this from a learning perspective, how do we foster this kind of harm envisioning early on in the design process? And we had 42 such participants with different familiarity with responsible AI and with language model prototyping. And we were looking at how this affected their ability and their approach to this harm ideation, as well as how effective it was and the challenges they ran into. So we ran a between and within subject study. I'll move a little bit more quickly for time, but you can read the paper for more details. But we had a couple of different conditions. One, we had participants use the full tool that I displayed. One, we were like, all right, that's a lot of information to display at any time. So we had a light version, which was just like the related news articles called Farsight Lite. And then the envisioning guide was sort of, we thought about that as our like control or the sort of status quo, which is basically like a PDF of this like harms taxonomy, right? Of like, here are the broad categories of harms. And we wanted to see, as I mentioned, like how does that affect people's ability to do this independently? So we structured this like we would a learning task. We had a pre-task where we had them independently try to identify as many possible harms to different stakeholder groups for a given application. Then we gave them either the intervention of various kinds or the control. And then we had a similar, what's called isomorphic task, similar kind of post-task, again, independently. Had an interview at the end. And then because we wanted also to do this kind of within subject study, for some groups, we gave them a different condition as well afterwards to kind of compare, and then had the interview another interview at the end. So at a high level, we found that after using Farsight in that sort of post-task, users were able to envision more harms independently. They focused more on users and use cases than the control, who thought more about like model level issues. The tool helped users think a little bit more about longer term or second order harms. That might sort of this idea of like cascading failures, like, well, if this happens, then that might lead to X, Y, Z. I will note, we did not, in the tool does not provide any kind of mitigations of how to avoid, how to remediate these harms. But after using Farsight in those conditions, users considered more possible mitigations during this prototyping phase. And we did have some survey items about usability and usefulness, although I will caveat, some of my collaborators and I had a paper at Chi this past year that many of these RAI tools are evaluated for their usability. Like, can a developer use this fairness tool? But that's a very different question than how effective is that tool in changing development practices or outcomes. So with that sort of caveat that participants found it useful and usable, but there are important studies to be done of like, okay, in an actual like ecologically valid study throughout development processes, how effective is this in changing practices? So I encourage you to read the paper for more. But yeah, we raised some questions about other in situ interventions to motivate learners during development for the kinds of practitioners who may not independently seek out a training or learning resource themselves, kind of smuggle in this learning into their IDE or development environment to proactively motivate them to identify these issues. And then this work raises questions about these trade-offs of automation and human agency. So I mentioned that we designed this to try to support developers' reflexivity and ability to independently ideate. But we recognize when we discuss in the paper, there's a real risk that developers might offload that harm ideation to the tool. And we tried to avoid that. In the paper, we talk more about some risks and questions there. There's questions raised in the study around the role of subjectivity, as in people's unique positionality, backgrounds, lived experiences, domain expertise, et cetera, in the kinds of harms that they identify. And this came out both for the participants and for how we evaluated the participants. The paper gets more into it, but the participants like wrote down these lists of like, well, these potential harms to these groups, and then we gave those to I think it was like 9 or 10 other people, not aware of the conditions of the study, of the hypotheses, et cetera. But we had very low inter-rater reliability among those raters, as in like we asked them to rate the likelihood and severity of the harms, right? Like it's one thing, of course, anybody could just list as many possible harms, but are those likely to occur? Will those be severe for the people? And we had a very hard time getting the third-party raters to agree on what constituted a likely or severe harm. And in the paper, we talk more about how that may have something to do with the sort of subjectivity, lived experiences, domain expertise of both parties involved. And this is why, again, we encourage engagement with communities impacted by AI systems, this kind of participatory design or co-design. And how might this foster mitigation? We didn't support this with the tool, but design could be a mitigation, or design choices could be a mitigation, right? I think often in AI, we think of like technical mitigations of, for instance, like guardrails or filters for model outputs. But those are post hoc, and making different design choices at the beginning of a project could potentially avoid some of these harms. And that was sort of the motivation of this work, intervening in the prototyping phase. You know, there's this Bill Buxton quote that we need to not just focus on designing the thing right, we should focus on designing the right thing. I know I'm almost at time here, but so this work raises some broader questions I would love to keep thinking through and discussing with all of you. As I mentioned at the beginning, or in the first portion, how do we integrate these social and technical topics in responsible AI rather than siloing them, both in the learning objectives or in the assessment or even in the resource, a separate resource entirely? Particularly for engineers who might be working in this area that's outside of the field they've been trained in. How do we move towards higher order cognition in responsible AI learning, towards application, analysis, evaluation, and creation? What would it look like to assess these more socio-technical skills? How do we balance this kind of scalability of self-study and this more collaborative learning approach? Yeah, what do all developers need versus just different roles? How do we balance this just in time? I have so many questions. I don't have answers to these questions, but we'd love to discuss and think more with you, about how to design these learning environments. And inspired by that second study, how do we move this work of responsible AI upstream from just a pre-launch review or testing to more early stage problem formulation or design? So that could include like the kinds of resources and tools to support this, or the processes. So this is a paper I had with some other collaborators on participatory AI. This is a really dense slide to put at the end of a talk, and I'm sorry. But the takeaway here basically is that we found across 80 papers that claim to do participatory AI, nearly or all of them focused on the user interface of the system, and very, very few on these broader design questions of should it be built, should it use AI, what problem is it solving? And so that is more of a methodological, right? Like we could develop more tools and resources for responsible AI that focus upstream. We could focus on more methods like co-design or participatory AI for generative AI. And this current paradigm, it's only our current paradigm, not necessarily the paradigm of AI, but this current design paradigm of pre-trained foundation models. How does this actually perhaps impede some of this responsible AI work that is very contextual, right? Fairness means something very different in different use cases, cultural contexts. But if you're, for instance, a model developer training a pre-trained model, how do you think about these potential enormous range of harms? And some of these methods like participatory design, value-sensitive design, may need adaptation for this current paradigm of pre-trained models, given their historical legacy. And you can actually read our emo paper on participatory turn AI for more thinking through of that. And some work from Harini Suresh and others at FACT this year on participatory AI and foundation models. So there's a lot that I think design methods could offer to our AI work, but I think there's open questions for how. And I will just say that some of this emerging policy and regulatory work from like the EU AI Act, as well as in the US NIST, calls out human factors in risk management, but there's open questions of how to do that and how to support that work in happening. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning that the field of responsible AI has a learning and design problem, and I would encourage all of you to reconceptualize responsible AI as a learning and design problem. So I want to thank my amazing collaborators, and thank you all. I think we have some time for questions.
I encourage all questions to be as information dense as that talk.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's very interesting and very important to consider these problems. I have two questions. The first one is more on the developer side. So you mentioned there are a lot of policy and related RAI stuff in the process. I wonder about their impact on the actual product being built. Is there any kind of assessment of or evaluation on each of the stage or each version of the process and their effectiveness on the actual product being made more fair? And my second question is more on the user side. So you've been talking a lot about all those RAI systems for developer or AI practitioner. But given a kind of biased model or problems with the current system, should the user also be aware? Should they be warned or somehow understand these problems?
Yeah, I love these questions. So the first question was around evaluation, and if I'm understood correctly, to what extent evaluation is happening at the model level versus product level, and by whom that evaluation is happening. Yeah, it's an excellent question. So I will say there certainly are evaluations happening at each of these stages for different types of things. So Laura Weidinger at Google DeepMind and her collaborators had a paper, I think it was last year, on sort of socio-technical evaluations, where they argue that they propose this sort of framework and different processes for model evaluations that might include risks that any product or application that uses that base model or pre-trained model might encounter. But of course, those are fairly abstracted from any use case or context. And then they look at more sort of interaction evaluations, sort of what you might think of a sort of individual, a user study kind of thing. And then sort of these broader societal or systemic evaluations of okay, what happens to an entire sector of the labor market or field if this were to be deployed. So absolutely, I think those evaluations have to happen at each stage. I would, and they may have this in the paper, I may just be forgetting, but I would go even one step further and say I actually think that we need more cross-pollination across each of those. So for instance, if you are an application developer working in say the education context. I'll speak to that just because I'm just more familiar with that. If you through your kind of user studies or what have you of your product encounter specific harms, specific risks, can we develop mechanisms to surface those risks or harms or evaluation results up to the developers of the base or pre-trained model? Some of that is maybe organizational processes, some maybe more sort of socio-technical interventions. And then I think all of those are somewhat distinct from the question of like effectiveness and how effective are those evaluations actually improving the experience. You had mentioned policy. So there is currently work, even though in the US the NIST framework is not a binding, it's not legislation, it's not regulation, but there is work happening within federal agencies. So within the Federal Trade Commission, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and various other federal agencies to enforce violations within their specific purview. So that, and again, going back to this kind of like contextual evaluations, I might encourage you to look there of like what's happening within like these domain-specific sectors or agencies. To your second question, absolutely agreed. We do need more both like support for users in learning about sort of responsible AI harms, as well as sort of guidance for them on how to use it responsibly. I'm a little wary of putting too much of the onus on users to use systems responsibly that may or may not have been developed responsibly. But I think for instance, I think there's a lot that could be done to communicate the limitations of language models. For instance, hallucinations are an unsolved problem. And I think that perhaps broader education or AI literacy around those limitations might inform how users of AI might decide, well, what is an appropriate use case where it doesn't matter if it hallucinates because this is just for like a brainstorming task or something. And I wasn't sure if this was in the question or not, but there are some resources and toolkits for community organizations and to like advocate for responsible AI, to support that. So there was some work out of UW led by Peaks Craft, Mike Cattell, Meg Young, and others called the Algorithmic Equity Kit. So in maybe it's not. I had a paper where we looked at these sort of like AI ethics toolkits and who their audience was. That was a Richmond Wong et al. Paper. There's not as many that are geared towards community organizations and sort of the broader public as there are towards developers. But that's like an open area then for folks to contribute to. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this was a wonderful talk. Thank you. I know like a lot of the responsible AI discussions in the industry are kind of gone more in the Gen AI category, but there's still a lot of AI that is used, for example, small models on the edge devices and so on. And I think what we struggle with, like you said, is just the ship it now mentality, and then realizing a year later that actually the model was fundamentally biased because we just didn't set the ground rules, right? Like we didn't know what the, like something like simple like video super resolution. It adds more white hair on people or like wrinkles on people, and like the actual users in the product, when we went into the real app experience, it bombed and the engineers were quite upset, like why are people getting so upset? So it's like people are getting upset, and so I think really fundamentally it's we haven't figured out how to figure out what the data distribution should be in the design phase for the models to come out fair. So the input design is still a bit of an art and science and just people winging it.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah, and I do think focused a lot on generative AI in this talk, but I could not agree more that the issues of bias, fairness, responsible AI are an unsolved problem for more sort of supervised learning, more sort of classical machine learning as well. I do think at the very least there are slightly more resources out there to support that. Not that that is a solution, again with caveats of just because there is a toolkit and people can use it doesn't mean it's effective. But for instance, a lot of the ones in this paper that we surveyed do focus on data collection and processing specifically for teams that are training their own model. And I do think there's at least more opportunities for a team to intervene at that stage with the caveats that we've seen in some of our prior work, and I totally empathize with, of the organizational incentives are to just ship products. People are getting promoted for shipping products and not shipping products, you know what I mean? However, it at least is perhaps within the scope of things they could control, versus for pre-trained models, what really worries me is that often an entirely different part of the company, or maybe an entirely different company has trained a base model or foundation model, if you will, on a data set that was not disclosed, and now third-party companies are using that API. They don't know what was in the training for that base model. They can't use, even if we have toolkits to evaluate data distributions or try to have more fair training data sets. They can't inspect it. They can't remediate it. They can't retrain it. At best, maybe they could fine tune it, or reinforcement learning with human feedback, like tune the model post hoc. But yeah, no, I agree with you, and I do think particularly in high stakes settings in the public sector, and this is just my take, based on no data, just intuition and observation. I actually think those more traditional machine learning models are much more widespread, in part because of that ability of the auditability of it, the traceability of it. So I think there is a lot of room for improvement, a lot of room to move the needle there, and it's a thornier issue for generative AI, but it's not a solved problem for machine learning either.
Maybe one last one.
So you talked about working with a lot of different roles, so PMs, UXers, engineers. I'm wondering if you've seen differences in how they think of implementing responsible AI and where they could get it wrong, in their work context. And what does that mean in terms of the learning resources you provide them? Is there a one-size-fits-all learning resource, or should that differ?
It's a great question. I'll admit, I have the same question. So in one of our previous papers, we did, let me see, this one is at FACT in 2023. We looked at this idea of cross-functional collaboration, and specifically looking at this issue of what do UX researchers, what do program managers, what do data scientists, et cetera, see as within their purview for responsible AI? What kinds of knowledge do they bring to bear when they collaborate across these disciplinary boundaries? We talked a little bit more in that paper. We actually started that project being okay, and we're going to develop a approach to solve these collaboration problems. Well, we didn't, but we did at least try to scope out what are some of those issues, and part of it is a lack of a shared language, or these kinds of suitcase terms like fairness that bundle in lots of different definitions or meanings. That maybe when the data scientist says fairness, they mean equalized odds or demographic parity or something like that, and when the UX researcher or social scientist says fairness, they mean something very different. There's just one example. So I think there's both issues in this kind of interdisciplinarity, and I think this question of customized, role-specific, or more general trainings. I mean, I kind of think we don't really have enough of these kinds of just learning resources in general. So I think we just kind of need all of it. But it's a good question, and I think in part this collaboration question makes me wonder whether it's like, well, we need a little of both, right? Like maybe every role involved needs to know something so they can speak across these disciplinary boundaries to these other roles, and at least be able to know, like, okay, generally how are models trained? What does fine tuning mean? Like these kinds of things, to be able to even talk about these as like interventions or design opportunities. It's a good question, though.
Let's thank our speaker.